Chapter 3. It warms you twice. Christmas was over at grandmother's house. The old oak beams were still decorated with trails of ivy, and there were still branches of holly stuck in the tops of the picture frames. The last turkey bone he had picked, the last thimble found in a pudding. They had even got a good way around the Christmas cake. They had been to a circus. Barney lay in bed in the grey morning light. For once he was not in a hurry to jump out of bed. The air in the room felt icy to the end of his nose. Let me see, he thought. Is there anything special to look forward to today? He couldn't think of anything. He was looking at the thick black beam in the wall that grew out of the floor right up to the ceiling. It had been part of a ship before it was part of the house, Grandfather said. It had deep holes cut out of it where other bits of timber had fitted into it. What was hidden in one of the holes? Barney sat up in bed suddenly. It was the flint, Stig's flint, left there since the last time he had come to stay, and he hadn't even thought about Stig at all over Christmas. He got out of bed and looked out of the window. There was white frost on the grass. A few hopeful birds hung about the bird table, fluffed up like woolly balls, waiting for some food to be put out for them. He reached up and took out a flint. It was like a lump of ice. I wonder what it's like living in a cave these days, thought Barney. Poor Stig. He must be cold. After breakfast, Barney slipped out of the house and went off to the pit. In the copse, the frozen leaves crunched like cornflakes under his feet. He climbed down into the pit on the far side, where the cliff was lowest, and he hurt his fingers holding on to the icy tree roots. The nettles were all dead in the bottom of the pit, and the old cans had lumps of solid ice in them. There was no sign of life in the shelter, though he noticed the ashes of a small dead fire, and the faint smell of wood smoke still hung around. But at the back of the cave was a kind of nest made of bracken and dead grass and newspaper. He thought he heard breathing sounds coming out of it. "Stig," Barney called, but nothing happened. I wonder if he's like a dormouse, he thought, and goes to sleep all winter. He called again. "Stig, are you there?" There was a rustle in the nest, and a mop of black hair poked up out of it. Underneath, it was Stig's face. But it was screwed up in a very strange expression. He was cross, wondered Barney. Is he cross? Wondered Barney anxiously. His eyes still screwed up at his mouth, and his mouth was shut. Stig took a deep breath. Then he sneezed. It was a sneeze like a cannon going off, and it made the cave echo. "You did give me a fright," said Barney. "You've got a cold, Stig. No wonder. When you live like this in a damp place, you need a good fire." He looked around the shelter and the cave. There didn't seem to be any wood to burn. Stig's heavy flint axe was leaning up against the wall. Barney picked it up, but he saw that the edge was crumbled and blunt. "You'll have to sharpen this," said Barney. Stig crawled out of his nest, blinking stupidly. He moved as if his joints were rusty, and he did not take the axe back that Barney held out to him. "All right, I'll do it then," said Barney. "I expect it's quite easy." He sat down with the axe between his knees and picked up a heavy iron bolt and tried to remember how he had seen Stig chip the flint. But it was painful holding the cold flint and the cold iron, and his fingers were so clumsy that they would not do what they wanted them to do. "Oh, never mind," said Barney. "Come on, we've got to go get some wood." He stood up with the axe and went out of the shelter. Stig followed halfway, half frozen and silent. They climbed up out of the pit and looked around the copse for some wood to cut. Barney could see now that someone, probably Stig, had been chopping and breaking down the dry branches. He chose a fairly thin thorn tree and set to work on it. "Oh, hi, Nay." "Oh, it's glad to see that you're watching. You still can't spell my name right, though. That's slightly annoying. I'll let you away with it." The axe swung. The tree shook. The flint bounced off the tough bark, but he didn't seem to be getting anywhere. Stig just squatted miserably on the bank, with his arms wrapped round his knees. "Here, you have a go," puffed Barney. "It'll warm you up anyhow. My grandfather says wood warms you twice. Once you cut it, and once you burn it." He handed the axe to Stig, but Stig only looked at it sadly and shook his head. Barney got worried. Don't be sorry, Anne. Barney got worried. He really must do something about Stig. Suddenly he had an idea. "Wait here, Stig," he said. "I won't be long." Barney ran off through the copse and up the field towards the house. He went to the shed at the back and got his grandfather's big steel axe and the long, sharp, cross-cut saw. And what else did he need? Yes, a coil of rope. He slung it over his shoulder and made off again down the field to the copse. "Here you are, Stig," he called as he came up to the Stig, still huddled on the bank. The sight of the shining steel axe worked like medicine on Stig. He uncurled himself and picked the axe up by its long handle. He tried its sharp edge with his thumb. He weighed it in his hands and swung it like a golfer testing his new club. His black eyes lit up and he looked around for something to use his new weapon on. Standing amongst the saplings of the copse was a tall ash tree with a trunk at least 2 feet thick. Stig marched up to it, swinging the axe. "Oh no," cried Barney, "you mustn't. Not that one, Stig." But there was no stopping Stig. At the first blow, the blade bit deep into the tree. White chips flew as he swung again and again. Barney hopped around him excitedly. "Stig," he called, "do you think you ought to—" "Oh, Stig, isn't it too big? Stig? Stig. I didn't know that you were such a chopper. Well done, Stig. Let me have a go." There was soon a great wedge cut out into the side of the tree, but it was only still halfway through. Stig stopped for a rest, and they both looked at the tree. It swayed a little in the breeze. "You know what, Stig," said Barney. "It's going to fall and smash the fence if we're not careful. I better tie a rope to it." He slung the coil of rope around him and pulled himself up by the lower branches of the tree. He had climbed most trees about before, but he had never climbed one that was already chopped halfway through. He supposed he should have tied the rope before they started cutting. As he climbed higher, he could feel something different about the swaying of this tree. It did not have the springy, exciting sway of a sound tree. It was only swaying a few inches, but at the end of each sway, you had a feeling that it was waiting, not quite sure whether it would sway back again, or whether it would just go on and fall. He tied the rope to the trunk as high up as he dared, threw the rope outwards and watched it uncoil to the ground, and scramble down again himself. "Now we ought to saw it on the other side," said Barney. "I've seen Grandfather do it." He picked up the big cross saw. "Here, you take the other end," he told Stig. Stig looked at the saw doubtfully. He felt its sharp teeth and grunted approval, but he still did not understand what they were going to do with it. "Look," said Barney, "you hold that end, and I'll hold this end. And I pull, and then you pull. It's easy once you get started." Stig still looked a bit blank. They scraped away clumsily at the bark of the tree trunk until the last saw teeth cut a straight groove and settled into it. Stig's eyes widened as the sawdust began to fly, and he pumped the handle furiously. Fast. "We've got a long way to go yet." Cut out about there. "Stop!" cried Barney. "Look, Stig, you're pushing as well as pulling. It makes the saw bend, and it makes you tired too." At last they settled down to a steady in and out. Snore, snore. The blade sang as it bit deeper into the wood, and the sawdust spurted out each end. Then the whole thing seemed to get sticky, and at last, however hard they struggled, they could not move it either way. "Bother," said Barney. "Now what?" They stood back and looked at the tree. The weight of the branches on one side was making the trunk lean that way and closing up the crack the saw had made. "We'll have to pull," said Barney. Stig and he looked at the end of the rope and heaved. The crest of the tree came slowly towards them, hung still, and swayed back again. They heaved again. This time the tree seemed to come a little further, hung longer, but still it swung back. With their third pull, as it rocked towards them, came a cracking sound from the trunk. "It's coming!" cried Barney excitedly. The tree swayed away from them again, but they heaved again, and this time there were more splintering cracks. "Once more!" shouted Barney. They tugged the tree slowly, hung at the end of its swing, and instead of rocking back again, lurched further over towards them. From the trunk came a splitting, rending, screeching sound, and Stig and Barney turned and ran. Barney heard an appalling rush and crash and splintering of branches behind him, as the crest hit the ground, and the topmost twigs thrashed on the back of his legs as he ran. They turned around to look. Barney's heart was bouncing with excitement. "Phew, we've done it," he gasped, gaping at the ruin that they had made and the big empty hole that they had left in the skyline. What a lot of firewood. That afternoon, Barney brought a hatchet, iron wedges, and a big sledgehammer down to the copse. Stig and he trimmed off the smaller branches, cut up the boughs and long logs, and managed, after long and patient sawing, to cut the main trunk down into 3. Then they set to work to split it up. This seemed to be a thing Stig understood. They started a split with the axe, put in an iron wedge, drove it in with a hammer to make the split grow, and then drove the other wedges until at last there was a satisfying split, and the fibres of the timber parted from end to end. The sky was now getting grey and dark, and the icy wind began to blow, but they did not notice it. It warmed you twice cutting wood. They trundled the logs to the edge of the pit and sent them crashing to the bottom, not too near the den. Barney looked up at the pale sunset and saw a kind of dust floating down from the sky. Sawdust? No. As it settled on the ground, it was white. It was fine snow. "Come on, Stig, let's get the fire going," said Barney. They went around to the entrance to the pit and along the bottom to the shelter, humped what they thought was enough logs and kindling inside, and then sat down, very tired, on the floor of the dark den. Now for a nice fire, thought Barney. Stig stirred himself. He picked up the gear lever of a motor car that was lying around in the den and poked carefully at the ashes of what had been the fire. But they were well and truly dead, so Stig sighed. Then he reached for his bow, which was propped against the wall. It was a fine steel bow, made out of a springy television aerial that sprung with picture wire. He took the leg of a hardwood chair, which was sharpened to a point at one end. He fitted the point to a hole in the block of wood which he held with his toes, passed the bowstring around the leg of the chair, held the top of the chair leg with a cracked egg cup, and he began to draw the bow backwards and forwards so that the string made a chair leg twirl. Barney watched, fascinated, as Stig worked away. He thought Stig seemed warm enough at the job, but Barney was getting cold. At last, the point of the chair leg twirling in the block of wood began to smoke. Stig quickly fed it with a handful of grass and started blowing on it, still fiddling away frantically with the bow. The grass glowed. Stig fiddled and blew, but everything in the cave was damp, and the little fire died out with a wisp of smoke. The bowstring frayed and snapped. Stig, exhausted, said something in this strange language, threw the chair leg across the cave, and sat there biting his nails. "Do you want a light, Stig?" asked Barney brightly, and he took the box of matches from his pocket and struck one. The little flames suddenly lit up the cave. The effect on Stig was amazing. He uncurled himself and leapt to his feet in a bound, and stood staring at the lighted match with round eyes. When the flame burnt down to Barney's fingers, he had to blow it out. Stig gave a sort of despairing moan. "It's all right, Stig. I've got lots more," Barney said. He struck another, and Stig jumped again, but this time crept up to it and stared at it really closely. "Come on, let's have some paper and twigs," said Barney. By the light of the third match, they found some, but they were not very dry, and it took another 3 or 4 to get a little fire growing. Stig was lying on his stomach, blowing the bellows, now gently, now fiercely, adding a twig here and a splinter from the wooden box there, building a careful pile, feeding the fire where it was needed. At last, the flames licked upwards. The smoke began to clear itself through the hole in the bath, and a warm glow began to light up the walls of the cave. Stig put 2 big logs crossed at the back of the fire, and they began hissing and sizzling happily. Stig stretched himself out in the warmth like a cat. Then he held out his hand to Barney as if asking for something, so Barney handed him the matchbox. "You want me to show you how to strike a match, Stig? Here, push the little drawer thing. That's right, but just not too far. Take out a match. Now you better shut the box. Hold the match by the white end, not the black end, silly. Now rub it on the side of the box. No, the side. There." After 1 or 2 tries, Stig managed to strike the match. He held the little flame and gazed at it until he'd burnt his fingers, and he had to drop it. Go on, strike another, urged Barney. Granny's got plenty. A box only costs about a penny, I think. But Stig wouldn't waste another. He took the box and hid it in his bed. It was clear he thought a match was a very precious thing indeed. Stig came back to the fire with his hands full of chestnuts. He put them in the ashes and lay and waited until the chestnuts popped. Then he took them out. Then he hooked them out with the gear lever and blew on them and ate them. There were plenty of nuts in Stig's hoard, and Barney ate 23. He felt wonderfully full and warm, and he lay looking at the fire and at the shadows dancing on the walls of the cave. But Stig was squatting with a faraway look in his eyes and a piece of charred board in his hand, looking towards a blank wall of the cave. He seemed to be looking through it, not at it. He moved up to the wall, his eyes fixed intently as though he was watching something interesting through a window. Then suddenly he attacked the white wall with his blackened stick. On the chalk he made sweeping black lines, and there was an outline of a galloping horse, more fierce scrapes of the stick, and there was a stag with antlers galloping. Soon there were little men running with spears and bows and arrows. Barney was hopping with excitement. Stig, you are a good drawer. I wish I could do pictures like that. Do some more, Stig. The men are killing the deer. For there was a spear stuck in the shoulder of a galloping deer, so that it hurt to look at it. But Stig took no notice, and did not seem to be aware of Barney. For Stig was not thinking about making pictures. He was out there with the hunt, galloping with the animals, running with the hunters, and in his hands, practised as they were at working with a flint and a tough bone, went on drawing the springy black lines on the white wall, as if they could not help it. Barney watched the hunting scene grow on the cave wall, and the last thing he thought about was time. There was no clock in Stig's cave, not one that went anyway. He went back to the fire to make it up, and caught a glimpse of the darkness outside the entrance. It was night, and he had to go back to the house through the dark, alone. Stig, I've got to go, he said, but Stig didn't hear. Barney looked at Stig's collection of weapons leaning up against the entrance. There was a spear, with a long shaft of a smooth hazelwood and a head of gleaming flint. It quivered when he picked it up as if it was alive. Stig, can I borrow one of your spears to see me home? Barney asked. Stig turned his head, saw Barney with the spear and grinned. Barney took that as permission to have the spear, though Stig was probably still lost in the excitement of the hunt. Barney took a piece of wood from the fire, one end of which was flaming brightly, and with the spear in the other he crept out. It was pitch dark and very cold. An icy wind made the flame of his torch flicker. He hoped it wouldn't go out. As he made his way along the bottom of the pit, he kept his spear ready, just in case. Perhaps the bears and the things were asleep for the winter. Perhaps there weren't any bears. After all, this was nowadays, wasn't it? The only dangerous things were motor cars when you crossed the road. Or was it nowadays? It was difficult to feel sure in the dark at the bottom of the pit. There was something squatting in his path. Barney gripped his spear tightly and held it poised. It was all right. It was just a big can, with Slap-It-On paint written on it. He gave it a friendly kick as he passed. He climbed up into the copse, and as he went through the trees, a white thing swept across the air. Without thinking, he jabbed at it lightly with his spear, but the owl, for that's what it was, swerved away sharply and ghosted off into the dark. Off with you, Mr. Owl, Barney said crossly. What do you mean by trying to frighten me? He was soon out of the copse, and by the time he reached the house he was sorry to have to come in out of the dark. He put out the torch in the water butt, put the spear in the broom cupboard, and changed his shoes. His grandmother and sister were sitting at the table eating crumpets. Barney, where have you been? Were you up in your room all this time? No, Granny. I'm sorry I'm late, but I've been out with Stig. You've been out in the cold and dark all this time? Oh, Barney. I wasn't cold, really, Granny, but poor Stig was nearly frozen to death, and I had to warm him up, and his axe wasn't sharp enough to cut down the little trees, so we cut a big one down, and the saw got stuck, so I had to climb up and pull it down again, and we cut it up and pushed it into the pit. And Stig tried to light the fire with a chair leg, and an egg cup, and a television aerial, but I showed him how to strike matches, and we ate chestnuts. And Lou, Stig's jolly good at drawing those horses that you like, and he was still drawing them when I left, with a piece of blackboard on the chalk." Lou giggled. "Granny, Barney said Stig was drawing with a blackboard on the chalk. He meant a chalk on the blackboard." Barney decided to join in the laughter. They didn't ask him any more questions after that, but Barney felt happier about helping Stig with his firewood than he did about the presents he had got for Christmas. Chapter 4. Long chapters, isn't it? Chapter 4. Gone hunting. Chapter 4. Lou had gone hunting. The North Kent foxhounds were meeting near grandmother's house that day, and a neighbour had offered to take Lou along and to look after her. Grandmother had not been sure, but Lou had insisted that there was a pony and she knew how to ride, so why wouldn't she? When the morning came, it was pouring with rain, as it had been for days. But Lou said that hunting people didn't take any notice of the weather, so she had gone clattering off the pony with the other riders, splashing through the puddles in the lane. Barney thought she looked a bit smug, but maybe it was just the rain trickling down her neck that made her turn her nose up. Barney stood by the window looking at the weeping grey clouds. "I'll take you in the car if you like, Barney," said his grandmother. "We could follow along the lanes." "No," said Barney. "Thank you," he added. "You'd rather amuse yourself here, dear, wouldn't you?" Barney nodded. He wandered off through the gloomy house, feeling sorry for himself. A cat saw him coming, and he must have seen the expression on his face, for it turned and bolted through the hall, and into the back kitchen, where it shot into the broom cupboard. Barney went after it. When he got to the broom cupboard, he remembered something. Yes, there among the brooms and mops and feather dusters was Stig's spear. He untangled it from all the other handles and brought it out into the light, gave it a rub with a duster, and the flint blade glinted. It shook, and the smooth wooden shaft quivered. It was a real hunting spear, there was no doubt about that, and Barney's face suddenly lightened. Lou wasn't the only one who could go hunting. Barney looked at the wintry sky. Hunting people didn't take any notice of the weather, he thought. All the same, since nobody had told him he ought to, he decided to put on his rubber boots and mackintosh and sou'wester hat. He felt like a whaler with a harpoon. He squelched through the empty paddock and into the dripping copse. He was glad to see that there was a wisp of smoke coming from Stig's end of the pit, and a smell of wood smoke hung about the copse. He went around to the entrance of the pit. At the bottom was a lake of rainwater with old cans and light bulbs floating sadly around it. But Stig was there in his den, sitting quite contentedly by a cheerful fire. He looked alarmed at first, not recognising Barney in all his rainwear, but as soon as he saw Barney's face under the sou'wester, he grinned. "Hello, Stig," called Barney. "Would you like to come hunting with me?" Stig went on grinning, but made no move. "Hunting, Stig," urged Barney. "Foxes. Seek 'em out, Stig." Barney made fierce stabbing motions with the spear, and galloping movements in his rubber boots, and even imitated a hunting horn. Da-da-da-da! Stig started to look excited, but he was still puzzled. Barney took his hat off and scratched his head. How was he to explain to Stig about the meat of the foxhounds, and how he wanted them to join in? He looked at the drawings on the wall of the cave, and it gave him an idea. He put down the spear and picked up a charred stick. "Look, Stig," he said, "fox." And he carefully did his best drawing of a fox on the wall of the cave. Stig looked alarmed, if anything, but Barney went on drawing. "Hounds, Stig," he said. Stig's eyes grew very big and round, but his face did not yet show that he understood what it was all about. "Crackers," thought Barney, "I'll have to draw the horses now." But Stig had already drawn some horses, so he only had to copy. He was rather pleased with his horse, and at last Stig seemed to understand. "I'll have to put someone riding the horse," thought Barney. "I'll do Lou. There's the reins, and there's her riding stick." There was something about this human figure actually on top of the animal that really seemed to excite Stig. His eyes blazed, and he jumped up and seized his best bow and a handful of arrows, and he looked hopefully at Barney like a dog who knows he's going to be taking on an exciting walk. "Good old Stig," cried Barney. "That's the idea. Come on, Let's go." And without even thinking of putting on any extra clothes against the wintry weather, Stig danced out into the rain, and Barney with him. From deep in the distant woods came a toot of a hunting horn. Barney and Stig set off across the country towards it, down the muddy cart track that tunnelled into the woods and into the fir plantation. As they trod softly over the carpet of the fallen fir needles, Stig suddenly stiffened and raised his bow. Barney looked up. At the top of a fir tree was a squirrel, stripping a fir cone. Barney pulled Stig's arm. "Don't fool about, Stig," he said. "It's foxes we're supposed to be hunting, not squirrels. Come on, or we'll never find the hunt." The squirrel shook its tail, ran to the end of the branch, and sprang into the next tree, where it disappeared. Stig looked a bit annoyed, but he lowered his bow and they went on their way. They came into a woodland of tall, sweet chestnut trees and oaks. As they came near one of the oak trees, Stig dropped to the ground and began crawling carefully forward. "What is it, Stig?" asked Barney in a loud whisper. "Is it a fox? Where? I can't see anything." Without looking around, Stig waved his hand as if he wanted Barney to get down too. He dropped to his hands and knees and onto a bramble. "Ouch!" yelped Barney. "It's prickly." And as he did so, a flock of 12, no, it must have been more than 20 wood pigeons sprang out into the air and flew off with a great beating of their wings, every one of them stuffed with fallen acorns which they had been gorging. Stig let a loose arrow into the flying flock, but somehow failed to hit anything. "Oh, sorry, Stig," said Barney. "I didn't know it was pigeons." "Still, we're not supposed to be hunting pigeons, you know. People don't. When they go fox hunting, they don't take any notice of anything else." But this time there was such a fierce scowl on Stig's face that Barney began to feel almost afraid of him. They walked in silence down a woodland track which held great pools of rainwater. Stig splashed through them without seeming to care about how muddy his legs were getting. Barney waded more slowly behind, rather worried that the water might come over the tops of his boots. He saw Stig fit another arrow and raise his bow again. Across the track ahead strutted a proud cock pheasant, and before he knew what was happening, Stig's flint-tip arrow struck. With a pounce, Stig picked up the body of the pheasant, pulled the arrow out, and stuck the pheasant behind him into his girdle. The long brown feathers wagged as if he had sprouted his tail as he walked on, but Barney was not happy at all about killing this pheasant. It was bound to be poaching, or the wrong time of year, or not sporting to shoot them, except with a real gun and cartridges, or something. It would have been better to stick to squirrels and wood pigeons. But he did not say anything this time. The tootling of the horn was getting nearer and nearer now, and there were crashings in thickets and the voice of a huntsman encouraging the hounds. Stig stopped and looked about him, and Barney ran up and caught with him. "It's the hunt, Stig," he said. "There must be foxes here somewhere. Keep a good lookout, and we might see one." The crashings and the voices seemed quite close, and Barney suddenly thought that perhaps the huntsmen would be angry if they found them in the middle of the wood, especially with a poached pheasant. There was a bank with a sort of little cave under the exposed roots of a beech tree, and Barney pulled Stig into this. As they lay hidden there, they both sniffed. There was a strong and peculiar smell hanging about the place. They lay there and waited. Barney tried to crawl backwards as far down the hole as he could. "That's funny," he muttered. "Somebody's put sticks in here." In the mouth of what seemed to be a large rabbit burrow, they were fixed 3 stakes of hazelwood, so that no animal that was bigger than a mouse could possibly get in or out. To pass the time, Barney kicked and worried at the stakes until he got them loose, and then cleaned the mud and chalk off them. "Look, Stig," he said, "you can make arrows out of these, or perhaps they're a bit thick." "Thanks, Mark." But Stig was not listening. He was looking up at the track, at an animal the size of a dog, with reddish fur, sharp ears, and very bright eyes, calmly walking towards them with his tongue hanging out. Barney's heart missed a beat. He got slowly to his feet, gripping his spear. "Fox," he hissed. "That's it, Stig. It really is a fox." He levelled his hunting spear at the fox, and wished he had the bow and arrows. But perhaps he could spear it. "Stig," he breathed. "Come on, now it's your chance." But this time Stig did not raise his bow. Instead, he took hold of the end of Barney's spear and held it so that he could not throw it. The fox strode calmly up to their feet, gave Stig a glance, and vanished down the hole. Barney nearly burst into tears of rage. "But Stig, why did you let him go? You're supposed to kill the foxes. That's what hunting's for. That's why we came." But Stig grinned in a rather superior way. He pointed down the hole after the fox, acted a little pantomime as if he was eating, and screwed his face up as if he was tasting a bad taste. He made it quite clear that he thought Barney was mistaken and wanted to kill something you couldn't eat. The scufflings in the undergrowth seemed to be just the other side of the bramble patch on the edge of the track. "Quick, Stig, they're coming!" exclaimed Barney. "Get back into our hiding place." And he pulled Stig back into the mouth of the earth. As he did so, a large foxhound came out onto the track and lolloped towards them on the scent of the fox. It came straight for where they were hiding, looked up and saw Stig, and bared its teeth and growled. Stig bared his teeth and growled back. The hound looked surprised. It wasn't sure whether Stig was an animal or a human, but he was certainly lying between it and a good strong scent. The hound took a step forward, making horrible noises in his throat. Stig took a step forward on his hands and knees, making horrible noises in his throat. Barney sat at the back of the little cave, holding his middle. The hound looked very big and fierce, and he was afraid it might hurt Stig. But then Stig was looking very fierce too, and he might hurt the hound. Stig was the first to move. With a lightning spring, he darted forward and bit the hound hard on the ear. It was too much for the poor animal. It was not afraid of sharp-toothed foxes or other animals that fought back, but Stig smelt like a man, and he had never heard of a man biting a dog. It turned off and made a yelping sound with its tail between its legs. Barney looked at Stig. "I think we'd better go home," he said. "We're supposed to be fox hunting. And what have you done? Killed a pheasant, helped a fox, and bitten a hound. What are you going to do next? I'd like to know." But once again, Stig was not listening to Barney. He was hearing something new, the thud and squelch of heavy hoofs moving through the woodland glades. And perhaps he was smelling another animal smell. The horses of the hunt followers were moving through the wood, and now at last Stig's face was alight with excitement of the hunt. Without a sound or a look to Barney, he slipped into the undergrowth and started flitting from thicket to thicket, from tree trunk to tree trunk, towards the sound of the horses. An arrow already strung in his bow, and he held his left thumb. Barney followed as best as he could through the undergrowth, with a feeling that something had gone badly wrong with his hunting trip, and that something far worse was going to happen at any moment. Stig seemed to pass through the banks of the bramble without feeling or caring for scratches, but Barney's mackintosh was always getting caught and ripped, and low branches snatched his hat off, and his rubber boots did not save his knees from scratches. And the more he tried to keep up with Stig, the hotter and crosser he was getting. When he came up to an open space at last, he saw Stig, and Stig saw what he was doing. All he could do was cover his face with his hands and moan softly to himself, "Oh, no, 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 no." Standing in the track, where the huntsman had left it to go into a thicket on foot, was a huntsman's white horse, hiding behind a mossy stump, his eyes blazing with excitement, his bow bent to the full, with an arrow pointing straight at the white horse, was Stig. Stig was really hunting now, and to him horses were meat. Lou sat on her pony at the edge of the wood. On one side of the black trunks of trees dripped sadly, and the wind moaned in the branches. On the other side, low ragged clouds swept over the bare stubble fields. Around her were various ladies and gentlemen and children of the hunt, on board of fidgety horses, waiting around for something to come out of the wood. They had waited by a field of cabbages and found nothing. They had waited by a field of turnips and seen a hare. They had jogged along lanes and tracks and waited by copses, but they still hadn't found a fox. Lou's cheeks were glowing, and so was her nose. Her eyes were sparkling, her hair was hung down in wet strips, and her numb fingers could hardly feel the reins. Flash, the pony, who was in his younger days at least used to live up to his name, stood in a puddle with lowered head and blew steam from his nostrils into the damp air. "First time out with the hounds, young lady?" asked a hearty lady on a big black mare. Lou smiled and nodded, and a little shower of drips fell from the peak of her cap. "Enjoying yourself?" asked the lady. "Yes, thank you. Super," replied Lou. All the same, she thought, if only they'd let me go into the wood and poke around a bit, I'm sure I could find a fox. There must be something going on in there. At that moment, out of the wood, came the shrill neighing of an outraged horse. All the waiting horses pricked up their ears. Riders nervously shortened their reins. There seemed to be a sort of commotion among the riders who had gone some way into the woods. Horses were backing and rearing, turning in spite of their riders, snorting and neighing. And into the thick of them plunged the huntsman's white horse, riderless, eyes rolling and nostrils wide with alarm, cannoning into the horses and riders and sending them sprawling in puddles and mud. It was a stampede. As the huntsman's horse bolted through the middle of all the other horses, they whipped round and joined in the mad flight. Most of the riders were caught off balance. Some lost their hats, some lost their reins or stirrups, some lost their seats straight away and were left on the edge of the stubble. Some of them who had been round the corner of the wood thought the fox had gone away and urged their horses after the rest of the field. All Lou could do was stay on top of Flash as best as she could and join the stampede. So this was hunting, she thought, though thinking was difficult at full gallop in the middle of a lot of other excited animals. Yet even then she had a feeling that there was something queer. Why wasn't the huntsman on his horse? And had she imagined it, or had she seen, sticking into the saddle of the bolting horse, something that looked like an arrow? And Lou was never quite sure whether or not she had seen something at the corner of her eye, at the tail of the hunt, a very odd creature indeed, coming whooping out of the wood. Had it been naked and mud-spattered? Did it have hair like a tangled bramble bush? Did it have rabbit skins around its middle and a sort of tail of feathers behind? And could it have been brandishing a bow and arrow? No. If one was old enough to go hunting, one really is told to believe in goblins and things. She must have imagined it. The hunt eventually scattered itself in all directions over the countryside. Riders at last reined in their blown horses and found themselves alone, or in small groups in remote stackyards. They decided they had a good day's sport and went home. Nobody was quite sure what happened to the hounds or the fox, but it had been a good run. Lou, after directing quite a few lost people, got back to her grandmother's house as the evening was beginning to close in. Barney had got back only a little earlier. They both needed baths, and they were both very hungry by the time they sat down to tea in front of the blazing log fire. "Well," said grandmother, "so you went off hunting after all, Barney?" Not really, like me," said Lou scornfully. "Well, no," said Barney. "I went with Stig, see? And he was ill interested in hunting squirrels and pigeons and pheasants, really." "That's not hunting," said Lou. "In England, it's only hunting if it's foxes or stags." "Well, Stig doesn't hunt foxes because they taste nasty, so we let the fox go. But it was so near I could touch it." Lou's eyes and mouth were round with disbelief. "It was, Lou, really? And then Stig bit the dog and started hunting the horses. It was jolly funny." Barney chuckled. "But I thought I'd better come home." Lou looked at Barney very hard, but for once she didn't say anything.